In recent years, companies have really learned that resilience requires viewing the world in a much more interconnected way, an interconnected ecosystem. We saw this in these various examples, but if we go back to the global pandemic, we saw lockdowns, we saw labor shortages, really exposing these hidden dependencies in global supply chains. Of course, that's now been further exacerbated over the last few years with further geopolitical instability and also risk being highlighted in these interconnected global supply chains. But if we look at some surveys of senior executives right off following the global pandemic, the most plan to shake up their supply strategies to become more resilient and more collaborative. Um, this public health emergency also accelerated a shift away from shareholder primacy towards stakeholder pluralism. And year two, research on the world's largest companies found that about 37% undertook specific actions to support stakeholder interests, specifically during the pandemic and the immediate period after, with community support about 71%, employee welfare at about 28%, dominating the actions. And as we sort of progress through 2026, I think this memory of the pandemic continues to shape our boardrooms discussions, specifically also in the continued press on global supply chains, with rising geopolitical tensions, and really focusing our discussions on resilience, on purpose, and the kind of capitalism that businesses wish to practice. Now, if we focus on sustainability, or at least from a regulatory landscape perspective, we see the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, transitioning from a proposal to binding requirements in 2026, and more than 50,000 companies must file sustainability reports compliant with ESRS requirements. And early adopters really found that CSRD demands precision when aligning financial and non-financial value. So companies must report how their business model impact sustainability and how sustainability issues affect your enterprise value. Traditional 300-page PDF reports have kind of been rejected, and research shows that stakeholders engagement drops sharply. One report showed 82% less engagement when reports are presented as a static document. Instead, companies are increasingly producing dual track reporting, also machine readable documentation filings for regulators to streamline interactive reporting for human audiences. Now, if we look at also what ISSB is trying to do with setting the global baseline around sustainability disclosure. So outside the EU, the ISSB is creating this global baseline through IFRS and also IFRS 2. And these standards, which came out in about 2023, are being adopted by jurisdictions worldwide, requiring companies to disclose sustainability risks and opportunities that could affect cash flow and cost of capital. IFRS 2 demands detailed climate information, including scope 1 to 3 greenhouse gas emissions and scenario analysis around this. And the implementation is phased. So companies may use proxy data for scope 3 emissions in the first year, but then must provide full disclosure in the second year. We also see a lot of pressure on 2026 and 2027, where countries such as UK, Australia, Singapore, Japan have committed to mandatory adoption, while others, including Brazil and Canada, Nigeria, have aligned voluntarily. And these standards are investment focused or investor focused, and complement your financial statements, and they build on the frameworks of TCFD and SASB as well. What's also important, obviously, around this is a dynamic environment. So there's also an omnibus agreement that does make reporting requirements less on some businesses. But the idea with that is also not to not comply, but to provide more time for companies to get reporting ready. I think what's important with this framework, though, is what we really want to get to is understanding our impact and our financial risk. And this is where double materiality becomes quite important. So while IFRS 1 and 2 use single materiality, so focus on information related to investors, the CSRD requires companies to apply double materiality. And this means disclosing both impact materiality, so how the business activities affect people and planet, and also financial materiality, so how sustainability issues affect the enterprise value. Directors acknowledge that assessing impact materiality is challenging. Qualitative and quantitative measures must be applied across the entire value chain. Dynamic workflows are required to connect impacts to business planning. So here too, boards must prepare for supply chain transparency and really robust internal controls as part of this CSRD readiness. Where this becomes interesting is we think of, and what I want to get to is also a connection to what many of us will already know quite well from a financial assessment and financial reporting perspective, is then integrated reporting in the six capitals. So the integrated reporting framework remains, I think, a unifying guide for value creation. Its long-term vision, a world where integrated thinking is embedded in mainstream business, hasn't changed. And the framework organizes inputs and outcomes and impact into six capitals, which is financial, manufactured, intellectual, human, social, relationship, and nature or natural resources. And if we just focus on the capitals, I think the capitals remind boards that value is created through interdependent elements, interdependent stocks. Maximizing one of the at the expense of the other erodes resilience. So integrated thinking encourages organizations to consider these trade-offs and design strategies that enhance multiple capitals. And this is where, or what I want to try and focus on, is this integrated thinking really as a strategic lens or a strategic radar to use to lead. Integrated reporting is not just about producing a document. It requires a shift in mindset. Really, if you look at integrated report as a concise communication about strategy, about governance, about performance, and prospects that create or erode value over time. So communication, this type of communication requires integrated thinking, where functions across the organization are accountable for sustaining value and understanding the interconnections among capitals. I would hope that the way of leading, I think the period we're in, this radar must be enhanced in several ways that I also briefly want to touch on. I think the first is that under CSRD and ISSB, boards must ensure that management commentary links strategy with risks and opportunity with resource use. And this includes showing how intellectual, human and natural capital drive financial outcomes and also affected by sustainability risk. I think dual track reporting requires machine readable ESRS and ISSB filings and dynamic human centered narratives. So leading companies design interactive dashboards and storytelling modules that allow stakeholders to explore data at different levels and in different ways. Scenario analysis and real-time data become very important. We see this through IFRS S2 mandates, climate scenario analysis being a requirement, advanced reporting now embed interactive scenarios showing how carbon pricing, supply disruptions, biodiversity loss could affect the six capitals, enabling investors to test those assumptions. double materiality and visualizing that assessment. Companies are developing interactive heat maps, dynamic materiality matrix to show how sustainability issues affect both value and external impacts. And these visualizations help stakeholders understand the priorities and trade-off in a much more effective way. And lastly, developing a very hyper-personalized stakeholder reporting. I think in today's environment, leading organizations use AI-driven portals that allow customers, employees, investors to customize the metrics and narrative they see. And this reflects a shift from this one-size-fit-all reporting to a much more tailored experience. If we look at lessons from, well, I guess lessons from recent challenges, but if we put a stake in the ground from the global pandemic to the continued supply chain disruptions to the geopolitical risk, I think what we've seen here is that supply chain optimized for cost efficiency remains vulnerable to shocks. So executives have to plan to build resilient, sustainable and collaborative supply chains. And so investing in digital technologies and retaining workers, integrated thinking support this shift by ensuring that resilient strategies considering human and natural capital alongside financial metrics become important. And this is included in a few ways. Supply chain transparency and data readiness become important. Also, with regards to regulations, of course, have to invest in digital traceability and supplier engagement to collect reliable data. Internal control over sustainability reporting to comply with CSRD. Companies are implementing internal control frameworks akin to those of financial controls, looking at dry run assurances, cross-functional committee preparedness. It really helps the organization for external assurance. We see already the collaboration requirements, so cross-functional skills and diverse expertise is required. And boards and leaders must integrate sustainability experts, data scientists, supply chain specialists into their governance to respond to this evolving risk and opportunity. Of course, there's also linked to this a broader discussion that needs to be held around stakeholder expectations. We also see this placing further pressure on leaders as expectations continue to expand. Communities, employees, and customers are increasingly viewed as global citizens who well-being is integral to corporate success, and companies that prioritize employee safety, community welfare, build trust during moments of crisis. In today's world, I think the expectation has become the norm. So integrated thinking here too aligns corporate purpose with the broader environmental, social, and governance responsibilities, and of course, the UN Sustainability Development Goals. And boards should articulate how their strategies contribute to climate action, to social equity, to innovation, to partnerships. Now, integrated thinking and ultimately integrated reporting doesn't stand alone from digital reporting and staying at the forefront of latest developments from an innovation perspective. So integrated reporting has become really digitally important. Design trends informed by accessibility and human-centered principles, reporting features where dashboards that update live data such as real-time emissions and diversity statistics allow users to drill down into specific regions or business units. I mentioned earlier storytelling becoming so important, so a story-driven experience and combining videos, motion graphics, and sound guide stakeholders through the ESG journey and highlight key insights, much more impactful than in delivering it in a flat format. Visual dashboards also reveal board compositions, committee structures, director competencies at a glance instead of making it more difficult to look through. And to many degrees, dual track architecture, so machine readable disclosures for regulators sit alongside curated summary reports for humans, reducing the cognitive load and boosting engagement. Of course, there's a lot of positives within there, but also a lot of challenges is how you can game that from a machine reading perspective. But ultimately, there's just too much data out there, specifically when you're talking about funds having to work through hundreds, if not thousands, of reports, which places a huge requirement on big data, but also then on AI. I think one of the most important factors, though, is in all of this is the leadership and the government's implications. Integrated thinking demands that accountability remains with the board. Delegation doesn't imply abdication of responsibility, and this expanded regulatory landscape and digital expectations call for experienced and diverse leaders. So directors must ensure compliance with CSRD, ISSB standards and double materiality assessments while integrating these standards into their strategic planning. Boards should prioritize outcomes across all capitals rather than treating integrated reporting as a compliance exercise. Impact must be measured, monitored, and fed back into the strategy through social and ethics committee or sustainability committees, or even your internal audit committee. Stakeholder environment is complex. Boards need members with backgrounds in finance, sustainability, technology, supply chain, human rights, so that diverse experience and continuous learning becomes a very important factor. And then proactive stewardship. I think when integrated thinking is embedded in culture, organizations move beyond reactive engagement to proactive initiatives aligned to each capital. So investing in innovation and employee well-being, restoring ecosystems and nurturing those social relationships. So as we close, integrated thinking, I think, has evolved from this aspirational concept as a strategic imperative shaped by regulatory mandates and digital innovation. And I think the converse of various of the regulations and standards and the rising stakeholder expectations means that board must embrace transparency, connectivity, and resilience. And companies must invest in digital accessible reporting, embedded double materiality assessment into decision making, which will not only comply with new laws, but also earn trust and build long-term value across the six capitals. So integrated thinking is really now a key capability, a key North Star for boards and executives to seeking to navigate in a volatile world, creating sustainable prosperity and fulfilling their responsibilities to people, planet, and of course to profit. Thank you again for listening, and we'll talk soon.